half of our July 22nd meeting and continue. We're to the rule revision.
Yes, President Preiner, Board of Managers, as you know, we've been working on the rule revision for quite some time. We have provided to you within the packet, starting on page 95, the rule as with the alterations, and Patrick has provided a cover memo to it. We did have some early comments back from managers. Patrick, perhaps you had a plan for us to go through the rule, and I kind of leave it open to the board, maybe a little bit if you'd like to go page by page and rather quickly, and we'll stop on maybe areas of interest. And then we do have a presentation as well by Houston Engineering. Patrick or Chris, did I capture that right in your minds? And then we'll see what how the board might want to do it.
Maybe we should do the presentation first. You think?
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea. I think we have the kind of open discussion on the rules at the tail end of the presentation, so maybe that might make sense to start with that. I can share my screen here.
Thank you.
Oh, and I see now I probably shared the wrong screen. Let me try this again here. There we go. Okay, can you see that now?
Yep.
Okay, so at the previous board meeting on July 8th, there were some discussion items from board managers regarding a few different items, and specifically following that, at the tail end of the meeting, we were asked to take a look at a few different items. The first of which was the proposed MS4 requirements and how they relate to the current and proposed rule language, and specifically feedback from the MPCA regarding how well our proposed rule change would be aligning with those MS4 requirements. The second item being a discussion investigation on regulating the duration of stormwater inundation. And then the third item being a comparison of the district floodplain regulation versus state mandated city floodplain ordinances and the National Flood Insurance Program. And these are all requirements that are essentially affected by the city versus what the district's regulation is, and having discussion of how they are similar and differ. So we'll begin with talking about the public linear water quality treatment requirement, and the question posed is, will the currently proposed rule revisions bring the Rice Creek Watershed District rule in alignment with proposed MS4 requirements? And that was, again, some question there because, again, the district several years back had modified its rule such that there is no longer a regulation of reconstruction of impervious surface for public linear projects. However, there is one portion of the proposed MS4 rule that does require that if under certain particular circumstances. And I'll compare that here. Currently, we have proposed a modification of the public linear, or I should say, currently the MS4 rule states that for linear projects, the water quality volume is equal to the larger of, and then we have two different items. One item would be 1 inch times the new impervious surface, or the other item would be 1/2 inch times the sum of the new and fully reconstructed impervious surface. So that's, again, the portion that is not within the district rule is that second clause of that. And then the other portion of that MS4 rule states that where the entire water quality volume cannot be treated within the right-of-way, a reasonable attempt to obtain additional right-of-way easement or permission to treat stormwater during the project planning process must be made. So essentially, they provide an out. You know, if you can try to meet this requirement, if you can't reasonably obtain that right-of-way, well then the requirement then would no longer exist for that public linear work. And so, again, the issue that we've encountered and the reason why we changed the rule a few years back is that these practices that are located within these road corridors, they are more costly to engineer, more costly for district staff to review, and they often do not function according to their design. Those are items that we specifically stated back when we modified the rule. And the district rules do provide some additional requirements that are beyond the MS4 rule. Specifically, the district rule requires infiltration where feasible, whereas the MS4 does not have that statement of a requirement for infiltration. It just requires that it be considered or looked at. And then the other area where the district rule is beyond MS4 requirements is that the district rule has a trigger of 10,000 square feet versus a 1 acre in a MS4 requirement. So district staff, Patrick, did reach out to the MPCA regarding this proposed rule change and how the district is attempting to provide an equivalent function to it. And you can see the response here that while they don't question the district's analysis that we would be providing an equivalent function, even though it's different in technical aspects of it, they do note that all MS4 permittees must incorporate the treatment requirements for linear projects. So they state that, yes, it would be an issue for the MPCA if we don't provide that portion of the rule, which would include a half-inch, a treatment of half-inch the sum of the new and fully reconstructed impervious surface. So there are a few options to look at this. And again, right now, the MPCA has a proposed rule. It has not been enacted. So we currently have the rule, which again just looks at treating the new impervious surface at 3/4 of an inch over that area. What we have proposed is option 2, which would be to go to 1 inch for that new impervious surface and make no change regarding reconstructed impervious surface. And then if we look at option 3, this would be then an attempt to fully provide the language and meet the language of that proposed MS4 rule, which would include adding that qualifier of a greater of that 1 inch or the sum of the new and reconstructed impervious surface. And then to provide an out for the public linear roadway authorities where it's infeasible to provide this, and this would again be something that would, potentially avoid future variance requests related to this. We added a clause in here of treating the reconstructed impervious surface may be waived if the right-of-way width is inadequate for the construction of stormwater BMPs. And then there'd be one other addition we would add would be that we would need to then, to even trigger this part of the rule, add a clause in Rule C2B, which would state that the qualifier of or create or reconstruct a total of 1 acre or more of impervious surface. And again, that would be so that the rule would even be triggered if you have public linear projects that only reconstruct impervious that wouldn't otherwise trigger the rule. So with that, our recommendation at this time from staff and the district engineer would be to go with option 3. This would avoid that need to modify the rule at the time of MS4 requirements, the proposed ones being adopted. And again, this would be consistent with the rule requirement and wouldn't increase the rule requirement beyond what should be mandated for the state standard. So with that, I think it'd be appropriate now for discussion on this, and certainly I can answer any questions you may have.
Okay, questions from the board? Comments?
Madam President,
Go ahead.
well, the 10,000 square feet is awful small to me, you know, that's like a quarter of an acre. It's one city lot. And so, the minimum requirement, of course, is, by 1 acre, which is, and I just don't see why we're triggering these rules when they're so small an area that's involved. I think you have to have the minimum of the state requirement is enough.
I agree with you on that, John. Anybody else? Why not be at the same standard?
So for clarity on that, your preference would be then to eliminate this portion where I have my cursor here, which would state that a permit is required to create 10,000 square feet or more of impervious surface. Essentially, to strike out that part, and it would just be then a permit is required to create and reconstruct a total of 1 acre or more of impervious surface.
Yeah, yes, that's I would. I think that could be it's clearer and simpler and more in line with what the state has and the cities.
Madam Chair,
Go ahead.
managers, I would just caution the district's trigger of 10,000 square feet is within a specific resource of concern drainage area. So the actual disturbance of a linear project may be significantly more than 10,000 square feet if it's apportioned among 2 or more ROC areas. And if we just make it an acre within a resource of concern area, that probably the MPCA would say that threshold is higher than theirs and too high.
Chuck, this is Bradley. We're only talking about public linear projects. We aren't talking about changing our overall rule, I don't think.
That's
Just
true.
linear.
The linear projects under the MS4 rule are treated the same as other work with a 1 acre threshold.
So I'm trying to understand, Chuck, if we did as Pat's suggesting and John is suggesting, would we be contrary to the MS4 requirement and inconsistent with our other rules, which we would retain at 10,000 square feet?
For public linear projects specifically, if we wish to go to an acre, I suppose I would suggest that we do it on a simple acre basis, not a resource of concern basis. Then we would match the MS4 minimum threshold. We'd still have, you know, our triggers distinguish between public linear and other projects, and we reason about those differently. So
would be the solution be then to make this as a standalone C2C? I don't, is there more to C2B? I can find that.
Well, I'm thinking that Chuck would, in order to solve that, we could simply strike out the phrase within a resource of concern drainage area on this, on C2B, right?
yes.
There you go. Okay.
Can I ask a question of Chris? This is Manager Wagaman.
Go ahead.
Chris, what do you think if we did do that, what do you think the overall effect is on what we're trying to accomplish?
I would say that certainly we would not be reviewing, certain size projects. Again, that would be between 10,000 square feet and an acre size. I'm not sure if I would know how many of those projects there are in the district at this time that we've been reviewing. And I don't know if Patrick or Nick would have a good feel of that, how many come in under that 1 acre threshold. Again, is it going to make a very large difference in the water quality or amount of sediment that's going into our resources of concern? I would probably say no, it's not going to make a large difference on that. It may change it incrementally. But then again, these changes also will capture some of the reconstructed impervious surface, so we will get the benefit of that as well. I would say, all in all, these changes that are being suggested here would essentially come to probably about a wash as far as the effect of the rules.
Okay, thank you.
Madam President, looking at our draft rules, we have separated out in our draft the non-linear projects and the linear projects. So doing as Chuck suggested, striking within a resource of concern, I think doesn't make a conflict or doesn't make it difficult. So we'd be able to have a standalone linear project rule.
Any comments, questions on this?
Madam President, I have a question about the top part of it, Chris. So this number 3 rule C.6 C2, is that language going to be identical to what the state's proposed language will be, or is this more restrictive language?
It will be identical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Madam Chair?
Go ahead.
Just also as one note here, and to keep in mind generally, what we're discussing now is proposed changes that we're going to put out for public comment. And during that period, we can engage obviously with the cities and others who are interested and continue our internal review, so that when it comes back to you after the comment period, you'll be able to make a final judgment.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do we have to come back with a new draft of this, or can we just have consensus of the change? What would be the proper thing to do here?
I would say if you could provide a consensus at this time, and then what we'll do is I'll modify the language that will go then into the packet for your next board meeting.
Okay, do we have a consensus of the board?
Yes.
John? Yes. Bradley, yes.
Yep.
Wynant?
Yes.
Yes, and Wagaman?
Yes.
And I say yes, so we have the consensus to change that. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
President Preiner, Board of Managers, if I can, I think Chris is maybe going to talk on it here at the end of the presentation. But yes, so today we're kind of looking for additional comments, and then we'd bring back that final proposed rule. The anticipation would then be for the August workshop, and then subsequent notice from the August 14th board meeting, I think is what it is.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Sure. So the next item was regarding the duration of stormwater inundation. And the question here was increased runoff volume from a development. It may increase wetness on downstream properties, or surface water duration on those properties, potentially affecting land use and the extent of wetlands. And so for that reason, there was a request of investigation of rule language to address this concern. So first, I want to talk about some of the considerations here, particularly how we currently address this issue within the rules, because we do address it, though not necessarily directly related to a specific duration. So a few different ways we address downstream impacts, first of which is the stormwater runoff rate control. This, of course, is most critical for addressing peak flood elevations. We want to make sure that we don't, or I should say that's one of the rationale for that is to try to avoid substantial changes in those peak flood elevations, but also addressing flood duration, because the adjusting, or I should say limiting rate from properties will prevent additional duration on some of those downstream properties. The focus of the rule is particularly on medium to large rainfalls, meaning, those anywhere from a 3-inch rainfall up to a 7-inch plus rainfall, which would be the 100-year. The rule doesn't address long-term wetness, specifically how it might affect water for extended duration over a growing season. The other component of the rule that addresses these concerns is the infiltration requirement, the volume control requirement. And, we've noted in the past that, we have this volume control for multiple purposes. One of the most obvious is water quality purposes, but for the district, it's very important for this reduction of downstream runoff volume. And so it is effective in addressing flood duration if the developing properties are able to infiltrate. However, where we do have high water tables or very tight soils, then the applicants typically are able to sequence out of that volume control, and then the rule is less effective. But this part of the rule does address both those large events, and it does address long-term season runoff volumes. And we've noted that particularly when we've done studies, say up in Columbus, in County 3146, that the rule is quite effective up in those areas because we have sandy soils there and water table that isn't quite as high in many of these areas that are developing. The C8, the bounce and inundation period, that does address duration, but more specifically to downstream wetlands. It isn't to all downstream properties. And that, again, is for a term of a medium-sized rainfall event, that 2-year rainfall or 10-year rainfall. One thing I'll note is that the purpose of these rules in general is for regional conveyance systems, regional flow management. We're trying to manage regional systems. The rules do provide some protection for downstream landowners, but that, again, isn't the primary intent. It's more focusing on protection of the regional systems. And as we've noted in the note here, the district hasn't intended to insert itself as an arbiter of private drainage disputes. So if there are a few challenges in modifying the rule to further address inundation, first of which is the extent of the problem is unclear. It's not certain what it is that we would be attempting to address here, how widespread this inundation issue is, and whether it's more an issue related to peak flood events or related to seasonal events. And solving that would be different depending on whether you're looking at addressing a peak or a large runoff event issue or seasonal issue. Evaluating the effects of the projects on inundation requires extensive and complex modeling. And that would be another onus then that would be put onto any developer coming in. They would need to utilize the district-wide model, and specifically the growing season district-wide model, I would say that most consultants for these applicants probably wouldn't have the expertise to even be able to work within these models. It's not something that it would be a whole level of magnitude different in modeling and analysis in order to do this. The simplest solution would be to require mandatory infiltration on properties. That would be highly effective, except it would also effectively be a moratorium on development in many of these locations, particularly where you have clay soils or high water tables. And again, you know, we don't know what the extent of this problem is at this time. And certainly doing any additional evaluation of potential rules, the effectiveness of these rules, or even the need for a rule, it's going to require research that's outside of the scope and time frame of our current rule revision. So at this time, we recommend no change related to this issue. Again, I can address any questions.
Any questions? Any questions for Chris? Comments? Consensus just to go ahead then with no change?
Well, Madam President, I brought this issue up, and I disappointed to hear there's a recommendation of no change, because this has been a long-term problem we hear about continuously. And I realize that in the areas where they have sandy soils, it works really great, but not the whole district is sandy soils, and and I realize it's a complex issue, and and I also realize modeling is necessary, and it's something I asked for before, modeling outside of just the MUSA districts, because it has a tendency what goes on, there's change. So I'm disappointed to hear that that's the recommendation.
President Preiner, if I could ask a question?
Sure.
Thank you. Chris, could you clarify the modeling that you're referencing? To me, maybe there's a distinction there between district-wide model and site-specific model and the receiving or downstream landowner. I expect that there would be need for extensive understanding of the soils and such on that neighboring property and those types of things. Am I capturing that correctly?
Yeah, Nick, that is accurate. And, you know, one of the challenges in trying to evaluate downstream impacts is, you know, noting how far you have to actually look downstream in order to evaluate the effects of a single project. So if we were to impose any sort of requirement for a specific applicant on a project to be able to look downstream and evaluate potential changes in inundation on those properties downstream, we'd have to be very specific how far down you look and what would be the qualifier. Are we looking for, you know, a growing season event or a event that would be of a larger nature? And then, as I noted, they would have to then utilize the district-wide model in order to make those decisions. And we do have several models that constitute the district-wide model. We have one that is for large rainfall events, covering 2, 10, and 100-year and snowmelt events. And then we also have a model that we've done in many portions of the district, not all, that looks at growing season volumes and runoff. And again, that type of model is something that would be challenging for many folks to be able to work within. It would definitely expand the effort required by both the applicant and the district in reviewing to try to determine how well the applicant is reflecting the proposed changes of conditions and evaluating whether or not there, you know, is a change downstream. And then the other way of looking at it is we could have some sort of rule that wouldn't require that downstream review, but would essentially place additional limits to landowners just generically. We tried looking at that actually when we were doing the future conditions modeling, and we looked at imposing an 80% requirement, or essentially reducing runoff by 20% on properties that develop. And if you may recall, when we looked at that in the watershed of I believe JD2 and JD3, and we found that putting such a requirement on applicants really wouldn't make much of a change in flood elevations and flood durations compared to the current rule when you start looking further downstream than, say, a mile. Once you start getting into the public drainage system, the further you go, there would be little or no change in the effect felt by such a rule in limiting flow. So we have done some research into this, but we haven't really found a solution other than that mandatory infiltration, which again would effectively be that moratorium on development.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Chris? Recommendation is no change. A consensus to move this forward with no change. Waller?
As I said, I'm not happy about it. To move the rules forward in a whole, you'll have to move the rule. They'll have to be moved forward. There's no question of that. But I don't agree with the no change issue.
Okay, Wynant? I'm looking for a consensus, not a vote, so.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Okay. Marcy?
Yes.
Okay, Bradley? Mike?
He has his mic off.
Sorry, I don't have a basis to challenge him, so yes.
Okay, Wagaman?
Yes.
And I say yes, so we do have the consensus to move forward with no change on this. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Next item is the district floodplain rule and how that relates to city floodplain ordinances. We should note that there are some overlap between the district floodplain rules with those state mandated city floodplain ordinances, potentially resulting in duplication and necessary use of district resources. At least that was the question brought to us in the request for investigation to look at this. So what I've provided is a table that compares the district floodplain rules with those city ordinances, which again are tied to state requirements and the National Flood Insurance Program. And first of which to note is the purposes of each. The district rules are focused on, first of which, regional flood storage preservation, and emphasis being regional. We're looking at trying to make sure that we don't negatively affect the capacity of those regional areas. And then the other item is to provide a freeboard from the 100-year rainfall and snowmelt events to structures. And particularly, we had noted earlier, I think Manager Waller brought up the statement that he had heard about looking at climate resiliency. And I think that the district already does provide some of that climate resiliency in having additional freeboard on some of these properties that wouldn't otherwise be provided by the existing city ordinances or the National Flood Insurance Program. So if we compare now to the city ordinance and the flood insurance program, their focus is really on preserving flood conveyance capacity, which is why they look at a floodway. They don't want to negatively affect those areas, and not necessarily in the whole floodplain, but just in the core central area of these larger regional systems. And they also are intended to prevent structural flooding from 100-year rainfall. So they really are looking at individual structures, and thus the purpose of the flood insurance program. So how we evaluate the rule compliance, the district uses its district-wide model. Again, the district has invested a lot of money over the years in creating this model and ensuring that it's the best available information from a regional standpoint. The city ordinances look to FEMA flood mapping in these non-detailed areas. And for many of these non-detailed areas, there isn't even an associated model to those areas. And then they look to FEMA flood models in the detailed areas. Again, those FEMA flood models were created many years ago. Most of them haven't been updated for a long time. This is one purpose of the current project that the district is working on with DNR and FEMA, is to help get some of those models that FEMA uses up to speed with the district-wide models so that they have the best information available.
Chris, when do you expect to be done with that?
So we have our modeling completed. It was reviewed by DNR. They've provided some comments back on that, which we're going to be addressing. And then the next phase of that will be to provide the official, or I shouldn't say the official mapping, but some map products to the DNR and to FEMA that they'll be using for this program. And we have those largely created already. We just have to finish those things off once we get the comments from the DNR addressed. Our contract will be going out to I believe to the end of this year. We anticipate to be able to meet that requirement, and FEMA will be completed with their side of the process sometime in 2021.
So those two will merge and it should be like one.
As far as the models go, now FEMA still was not planning at this time to completely update its mapping to be to match what the models were at this time. There's a whole nother process that's required in order to create the flood insurance rate maps. But when requests come to update those maps, then they'll be utilizing the models, which will be identical to what we have created now.
Thank you.
So if we move on to flood conveyance, the district does require replacement of fill within the Rice Creek Watershed District floodplain. That is a bit different from what's required under city ordinances, which would only prohibit fill in the floodway. Again, those are only a limited number of mapped areas have floodway on them. Those would be the what FEMA calls the detailed mapping areas, and it's only a small a portion of the floodplain that they consider to be the floodway. They do allow fill in portions of the flood plain, which they would recall the flood fringe, the outer edges of the floodplain, or in those areas that are in non-detailed mapping areas, and they would allow fill without any sort of replacement. So that's a substantial difference between the two programs. And then the last item would be regarding structural flooding protection. Again, as I noted earlier, the district requires 2 feet of freeboard. That provides that additional, we could call it resiliency from the potential flooding, or even particularly resulting from larger than 100-year rainfalls. Whereas under the city ordinances, they require a 1 foot of freeboard from the 100-year rainfall. They don't require that freeboard to be from even a 100-year snowmelt event. They don't necessarily look at that. And there's no building. I can't recall what I think I'm missing something in that last item there. But again, the primary change here is the difference between the 2 feet and the 1 foot.
Okay.
And then, I'll just note that the cities they do have the option of adopting more restrictive standards. As far as I'm aware, most of the cities within the watershed district currently are meeting the required standards. So some considerations that the district may have, as I've shown here in the table, the scale and purpose of these rules are entirely different than the city floodplain ordinances. There is some overlap, but there are a substantial amount of differences, and particularly on the focus that the district has in regional management versus building code enforcement. The district does have regulatory authority independent of the cities, which it may exercise as needed to achieve its goals. So it is an independent regulating authority. The district is uniquely positioned to understand regional flood management. That's a position that the cities are not in, because they're, again, focused on their own cities, whereas most of these issues, particularly in a regional sense, are developed from areas that may potentially be either upstream or downstream from those cities. The district floodplain volume management is necessary to preserve conveyance capacity along the public drainage systems. That's one important thing to note. That's one of the reasons that the district does have that rule in managing floodplain fills, is to prevent or to preserve that capacity along the public drainage system. Because the fill can reduce the cross section in these areas, and it would potentially result in higher flows and velocities along the public drainage system. And the district does have a role in floodplain management, which cannot be reduced without increasing the potential for flood damage risk along the regional conveyance system. So if the district doesn't continue to manage floodplains, there will be a reduction in protection. So there are a couple options to look at. One may be, again, to have no change in what we do in the rule. Another option to potentially look at is a modification of Rule C9G, which would be the freeboard requirements, which could be to eliminate freeboard review on some or all new structures. And again, it's one of those items that does go outside of a regional perspective when we are looking at managing freeboard on individual structures. However, it is important to make sure that we do preserve the floodplain for those properties that are maybe outside of a project in particular, or maybe even looking at projects that affect multiple entities, multi-purpose, multi-family housing, that sort of thing. So that's all I had on that item, and again, it could be open for discussion here at this time.
For discussion, anybody like to question or comment?
Madam Chair, this is Marcy. So I understand on this freeboard issue, I recall that there was a storage unit that didn't quite meet the 2 feet. It was close to it, and we were able to give a variance to allow that to happen. Does this come up frequently? And I just want to remind myself that in some of these rules, we are able to still grant variances on individual projects. So the frequency of it, and do we still have the ability to grant variances?
So
This is Bradley. I think I've seen 3 requests in 4 years. The other 2 requests were by homeowners, and we basically said, and they had existing property that already didn't meet it. So we said, well, that's kind of your risk then. I remember I was very concerned about the third one, which was that we were affecting potential renters, and the answer to me was by the other board members, well, that's the owner's problem, not yours. So I guess we've not enforced it other than where it happens to be fortunate. So I do see it's protecting the landowner, not protecting the public.
Manager Wynett, Manager Bradley, just one further comment. The application being discussed there is that public storage project. An additional complicating factor on that one was that, it was after the fact that some of that information was received. So after the building had already been started on construction when that variance application was submitted.
So it could have been done differently if we had known up front they were doing it.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, how do we want to move forward? Consensus, anyone? Go with the no change?
I actually like having the additional foot. And to the part of resiliency, this I think that shows that we're at least looking forward.
So Chris, if you'd remind me, Bradley here, if you'd remind me, why is it that all of the cities are uniformly at 1 foot?
Manager Bradley, that's because that's the state requirement, which follows FEMA guidelines. That's what they have adopted a long time ago. And quite a long time ago, I don't know how long it's been, the district decided that it felt more comfortable with the 2 foot freeboard requirement, I would guess for multiple purposes, but probably most likely because of the uncertainty of how frequently these storms come through and what the effect might be, even, how effective the modeling was at that time.
Well, this issue is not near and dear to me, but if the rest of the world thinks 1 foot is adequate and that we're not doing this to protect other than the builder, I can easily go with 1 foot, or I could go with the 2 feet we've got.
Well, it'd be nice to be consistent.
President Priner.
Go ahead.
President Priner, I'd like to ask Chris, in regards to the note on resiliency, and then there's also the better understanding of rainfall events. We used to talk about TP40, and then we went to Atlas 14. Those were based on actual data. We had a better understanding of the intensity and distribution of rain events. And from that, I guess, could you comment on that and how it interfaces with what we're discussing here? And then I know at one time we had a discussion about resiliency, specifically because the state was bringing it up and how we might do that. And our discussion went to, well, basically what you're saying is that the flood events may be higher in elevation, and so we could start looking at the 500-year or some incremental increase from the 100. Kind of hitting you with a whole bunch of stuff there, but if you could formulate a general response.
Sure, and you bring up some good points there. So when we went from looking at that TP40, which was developed back in the 50s or 60s, it had a 100-year rainfall event of about 6 inches in the district. Or Atlas 14 now has changed that standard for 100-year rainfall event up to somewhere between 7.1 and 7.3 inches in a 24-hour period. That substantially changed the flood elevation and floodplains throughout the district. And, had the district had only a 1 foot freeboard requirement, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, there likely would have been maybe some structures that would now be in the floodplain or at least be substantially closer to the floodplain, much less than 1 foot, that otherwise now have additional protection there, and at least a foot of freeboard because the district had that rule at that time. And by all accounts, it's likely at some point in the future the standard that we use for 100 years is going to be something greater than 7.2 inches. They're going to come out with something new that will say that 100 years maybe 7.5 or 8 inches. Certainly the long-term trends are looking like the rainfall for a 100-year event is going to be increasing. So it does provide added protection that way.
So this is Marcy again. So one might think about our rule as having more information, more current information.
Yeah.
And we're also thinking about the impacts on the watershed area as opposed to individual communities, which in my mind would justify the 2 feet over the 1 foot, knowing of course that we have the ability to issue a variance if there's specific problems. Is that correct? Better information and looking at it in a watershed.
Over a district, yeah.
President Preiner,
Go ahead.
to reflect on Manager Wynant's question and again engage Chris. Within your presentation, I believe you reflected on the district's overall position in managing rainfall events, stormwater, and it was a combination of storage and conveyances. And the conveyances that we deal with are obviously we're working through right now to get them back to their original geometry for capacity, but that a reduction in the storage, which really has to do with our requirement to replace any floodplain fill with equivalent, with the noted exemption that this rule revision also covers, allows us to maintain the storage so we don't have additional waters put into the conveyance system and jeopardize the or increase the flooding along the banks of it, as well as how it may undermine or show capacity issues at the culvert crossings. Would that be somewhat accurate?
Yes, yeah, I would definitely say that is accurate. Our focus in general is looking on a regional perspective, and even with our freeboard requirement, that 2 foot freeboard is on regional systems. The one unique thing about that is, again, the intent of it, of just that portion of our floodplain management, Rule C9G would be, focused on protection of individual structures, but it's at a regional scale.
Madam President?
Go ahead.
So as I read this, page 178 on our handout, it says regional flood management versus building code enforcement and disaster risk management. So the cities are the building code enforcement and disaster risk management. And that's where these 2 foot freeboard comes into discussion. But the regional flood management is what the district is supposedly interested in this. And the district then says, well, you can't fill the floodplain, and by fill, everyone immediately assumes that fill means soil. And the district has, at least in Washington County, on 2 large occasions, filled the floodplain with water. Portland Avenue had 4 feet of concrete put in, a culvert there, back it up into Schumann Marsh. And then the water, of course, is back higher than the input ditches into Rice Lake and Hugo. And these are hundreds and hundreds of acres of floodplain that follows storage capacity that's just been filled and lost. And this rule doesn't really
direct work with those situations. The district has made that decision that under their regional floodplain management, they didn't need the storage capacity, and they filled those floodplains, changing the elevation of water permanently. And that's also could be said of Peltier Lake when they raised the dam 3 feet. The floodplain and loss of storage upstream. So if we're talking about the district floodplain rules, and they're supposed to provide regional flood management, and they're not supposed to fill the floodplain, then how is it that we're filling it with water? And so that's a volume problem. And then, of course, the water being a solvent causes phosphorus loss to be go downstream, and it also in these soils that are muck soils results in a loss of oxygen. So filling the floodplain with water is not something that's directly worked on here, permanently filling a floodplain with water. And that's what the rules, if it's going to direct something that the city doesn't do, that's something that the city is absent from. And I don't know what the cities are because we haven't done a matrix on the rules yet to see what the city actual rules are. Not all the cities, we have 2 of them here. One of them where most of the buildings going on is in Hugo have adopted that 2-foot freeboard rule. So their building enforcement and the district rules are identical. So that's what my point about this is that when we're talking about these floodplain rules, the district fills lots and lots of floodplain with water. And that's just as detrimental. It's an impervious surface as filling it with soil. And the rule doesn't do anything to direct it to anything about that issue.
Okay. Other comment? Well, we need a consensus, so do we have a consensus for the no change? Just tell me if you do, or should we modify?
I would propose the no change, and to John's point about the cities, again, we'll have comments from the city about all of these rules, and they may have some other ideas.
They may convince us otherwise, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go with the no change consensus. Manager Waller?
I think the rule needs to be expanded some, but this time there isn't going to be any change, so we have to move the rules forward.
Manager Wyman?
Yes.
Okay, Bradley?
I want to wait and see what Steve says.
Manager Wagaman?
No change.
Okay, and I say no change. Let's move it on that way. When we get the comments, if we see something, we certainly can make up our mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm more than open once we get the comments back to look at it again, for sure.
Okay. Chris?
Okay, next item would be any sort of discussion we would want to have on rule changes that haven't been identified by staff. So I guess what I can do is I can bring up the rule here, and we could start going down the list here on some of these changes, and if there's I don't know if you have any suggestions, Nick, on how we go about, or Manager Prenner, how we go about this. I do know that we probably want to catch the items that have been provided earlier by managers and have, just note them as we're going here. Do you just want to go section by section, or do we just want to go essentially the comments from each manager?
I think if, unless somebody has anything new they want to comment on now, let's just go with the comments that have been made, and that might trigger some discussion. I don't think we need to go page by page.
Okay. So one comment provided by Manager Wynant was an explanation of a couple of acronyms that are used in the rule. One of them being total phosphorus, or TP. And so we provided, I provided a definition here, very simple definition of a total phosphorus.
Reiner?
Yes,
Chris, I believe you were intending to share your screen, maybe? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
thank you.
There's the screen here. So again, this is in the definition section.
Can you make it bigger somehow? Because I tell you, I can't begin to read it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's better.
Thank you.
Can you see it, Mike?
Yes, I can.
All right.
So we just have the definition: a measure of all forms of phosphorus dissolved or particulate in a given sample or flow. And really where we reference this at is with regard to our sequencing discussion under Rule C. We have a table that references TP. One other related comment from Manager Wynant was regarding caprock. And I'll note that we do actually, under Rule B, we have caprock identified in here. We say what the acronym stands for. We do mention caprock in a couple other instances within the rule, the acronym, but don't necessarily spell out what it is. If there's a concern that we need to actually include it as a definition, we certainly could. But I felt that the language we have in Rule B already here probably describes fairly well what we mean by it.
I would like to see it in the definitions. Anybody else? I just think it's a good place to look when you're trying to figure out what we're.
I agree, this is Manager Wagaman. I think that's a nice place to look at it too.
Okay.
Okay, I can add that into the rule for when we bring it back to you at the next meeting.
Sure.
Okay. And now I'm gonna have to apologize. I'm gonna have to zip through here real quick because, okay, here's the next change that was suggested by Manager Bradley. This is under Rule C5. So it's on page 17 of the rules that are in the packet. And the suggestion was to add the word total in here for clarity. So where we're talking about the impervious surface area that would be required to be reviewed related to regional BMP. If no other concerns on that one, I'll move on to the next item.
Chris, while you're looking, can I ask you a simple question off of page 17? What is nested rainfall distribution?
So that is basically an engineering term that would reflect the type of rainfall we use when putting a model together to evaluate what the flood elevation would be, or the flow would be coming off of a property that develops. It's basically, it defines how quickly the rainfall comes. If you have a 3-inch rainfall, it's going to peak at a certain amount of inches per hour, and there's a certain shape to how the rainfall comes in. Usually you tend to have a lower a rate of rainfall early in the storm, a very hard peak in the middle, and then a lower amount at the end. And it's all related to making sure we're on the same page as engineers with how we're going to evaluate it, because you can tweak things in the model to affect different results, and we want to be specific so we're comparing apples to apples.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So the next item was on Rule C10, another comment from Manager Bradley. We have previously in here a statement that the permittee must convey to the district an easement over the public drainage system, and he recommended that be changed to 2. And which staff agrees with, and that also is a change that will be reflected also in Rule E and Rule I, because we have the same language in there for all 3 of those rules for requiring easements along the public drainage system. Okay, move on to the next one here. Okay, and now this is under Rule D. This would be on page 35 of the rules. This is Rule D4 of subsection J. And Manager Bradley recommended adding the language to a wetland and or floodplain to the end of this statement here. Again, for clarity, so that we know what we mean by the proximity, what the proximity is to. Again, staff agrees with that addition. Moving on to the next item under Rule E. Here we again had another recommendation from Manager Bradley to adjust our language that we had related to public linear projects and how the exemption applies. The language that you have in your current packet, it provided, it was unclear on whether the exemption applied only to public linear projects versus all projects. So we moved the clause up to the front, and now it says for public road authorities, this exemption applies on a per project per floodplain basis.
Good. Okay.
All right. And as I noted earlier, we had that same change regarding the easement to change from to 2 in Rule E. I think the next one we go to, it would be under Rule I. And I apologize again for how it's taking me to move through this here. Okay, so under Rule I, another comment from Manager Bradley regarding the language under item 3, Rule I, the criteria, and where we state the work proposed project, project proposed to work subject to paragraph 2A, and we changed this to reflect the previous language just to say must with regarding these items. And then if we look at item F under the criteria, another comment from Manager Bradley is to provide some clarity here regarding what we mean regarding our interim project conditions. And so we changed this to say maintain hydraulic capacity and grade under those interim project conditions. Then the next item with regard to the access corridor, suggestion to add that the district deems adequate related to the access corridor, so that it's and then remove the language that said connected to a public roadway. That way we provide a little more flexibility if the access point is somewhere other than a public roadway.
Chris, can I stop you for 1 second? At the beginning, I had to take a bathroom break, and I missed when I heard you talking about whether we should comment as we go or at the end. I had a question on Rule I, and I don't know if you guys want to wait. I've got a few of them, but are we going to discuss this at the end where I can bring up my questions, or do you want my question on Rule I now?
Why don't we go, yeah, on Rule I.
Go on to the end?
Chris, it's up to you. Would you rather just do it while we're here on Rule I?
That is the extent of the comments that we've received
okay.
from managers, so I think it'd be appropriate to discuss anything else right now.
All right, well, in Rule I, I've got a few of them here. One on page 59. I'm just questioning why we took out on the beginning where it says policy 2, 3, and 4. Why were they removed? Are they in a different area somewhere that this is duplicative, or did we just decide that it wasn't important, or how did that come about?
Basically, we wanted to simplify what the policy was, and really the policy related to public drainage systems was focused on the board's management of the drainage system wearing its drainage authority hat.
Okay. I was just asking. And then I have one on page 13 of this. Where is it here?
Under Rule B? Yeah.
Page 13, that's just a word. I can tell them later on that. There's a word wrong there. I can't find.
Please do now, if you would.
Now,
Would you?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I got a few of them on number 3, under Rule B on page 13. On number 3, I think it should be the board shall act on complete permit application. Wait a minute. On applications. These are hard as heck to read.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm trying to remember how I had it. I thought I had needed an on in there somewhere. And
Yeah.
Well, it looks like it's run on with permit, Steve, so it's hard to read.
yeah, I know it. And wait a minute. It's the board, or the district shall act on complete permit application. Complete applications. Yeah, that's what it is. There it is. It needs to have on that put after act.
Yeah, and actually we do have that in there. Again, it's a little hard to read on there because I don't have the space shown in our marked edits here, but yeah, we do have that in there. Yeah.
And then down on 4.5, it says the district may conditionally approve an application, but a permit will not issue and work may not begin until all conditions precedent. And I don't think precedent, I don't know if you were looking for prescient or that doesn't really fit, but germane or something has to go in there to finish that off. I mean, I don't think precedent was what they meant to say, unless I'm completely off base there.
That's law school. That's condition precedent.
Yeah, I think so. I
If you
think that's
wasted
what
3
Chuck
years
is.
of your life, you'd know that one.
Okay, well then, but you're right. I didn't have a clue. Sorry about that.
No, I gotta say, I think that only the lawyers in the room know that one. So
And then there's one main one I had was on page 21. And it's a question on Rule G. It says bank volume control credits and debits established by public entities for public linear projects within Rice Creek prior to July 1st, 20. Where did that happen? I don't remember us ever discussing a prior to date or anything. And am I just darking out here, or is there something to that? Or what is the significance of that?
So that goes back to when the district eliminated the volume banking program or portion of the rule.
Okay.
And so at that time, they put in the rule that it would be prior to the effective date of the rule. Well, now we've undergone a couple of revisions since then, so we went to backdate it back to when that change was made.
Well, wait a minute. That would eliminate. Are you saying then that the cities that have had issues after 2013 are waived, or what does that, what's that telling us?
The requirements under the rule do not allow the banking of, or do not allow debits on new projects ever since July 1, 2013. So all the debits were created from
Okay,
project prior to
gotcha.
2013.
Okay, that's what I thought you were getting at, but I wasn't positive that was the case. Thank you. That was it for me.
Madam President, Brad, Chris, could you go to page 59 for me?
Sure.
Funny you say that. I got one on 59 also that I forgot.
I got it. I had somebody here looking at something. I missed. So we talked about changing F, 3F. Did that get changed? Okay, it did. Thank you. I just missed that.
Okay.
Okay, Manager Waller, comments?
I was curious about what Steve had asked earlier, Rule I in the policy. The 2, 3, and 4 have been eliminated. Are they somewhere else in the rule now?
That's what I asked.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Yeah. Are they someplace else where you've got these?
Please clarify.
Chris, President Preiner,
Yep.
Board of Managers, Chris, I think the initial statement is probably that Rule I did switch from overall drainage systems to being very specific about public drainage systems. And so, Chris, I understood you to share that our policy then is trying to be very reflective of that authority under 103E. Correct?
That is correct. Yeah, it again is specific to how the district engages in its role as drainage authority, and that's the lens with which we've tried to formulate the rule here. And that every item in here is really related to that management aspect of it. That really is a little bit of a different hat that the district wears from the rest of its operations. And yeah, you bring up a good point, Nick, that we did separate a number of items that were regulated under Rule I before and put those items into Rule G, specifically systems that are non-103E. That are greater than 200 acres in area coming to them. Those are under Rule G now. And so really that isn't the focus anymore of Rule I.
Well,
Is that in Rule G then?
President Preiner, Rule G then does have a policy statement that has been expanded or clarified.
So Madam President, Rule G is about conveyance systems. So that includes natural and altered water courses. And public drainage systems are just altered water courses. And so I wonder if by putting it in the larger scope of the entire conveyance system, if that's lost within the public drainage system, or how you make sure people that understand that the public drainage system is a subset of the conveyance system, and that those rules also apply to the drainage system that apply to the entire conveyance system.
I would just add that this was confusing to me also.
Yeah.
Nick, you responded that rearranging the rules would have some, the order of the rules would be problematic, but it does up here, John, that one is set inside the other.
Yeah,
I
President.
found this a little confusing too.
Yes, yes, President Preiner, if I could.
Go ahead.
Board of Managers, Marcy, to your point, I was referring to the codification, right? And so if we say that have a large alteration of, Rule C becomes floodplain and this kind of thing, those large shifts in codification would be problematic looking back because the reader may not know that it changed. And so if someone just references the rule, they may not know that the rule had changed. So that was the general statement. As far as the nesting, if you will, of Rule G and Rule I, and one is a subset of the other, each one stands on its own. All the rules stand on their own independently. And so for it's really the project as the district receives the application, and then we see which rules are applicable to it. Is Rule C involved? Yes. Is Rule D involved? And so it could indeed be both a conveyance system, and it could be also subject to the 103E provisions, and that should be definitely caught in reviewing the application. It also could be one or the other.
Madam President, real quickly, actually within the rule, we have totally separated G and I, meaning G does not apply to public drainage systems. And we actually did that definitionally. Public drainage systems are not a subset of conveyance systems within the definition. We actually created a new definition for conveyance systems that excludes 103E systems, so that we can have that separation. And that's the reason that we do have the changes in definition up in the front of the rule, so that we can look at independently systems that are non-103E through one lens, and look at the 103E systems in a different lens, because they're inherently different in how we manage them.
My mistake.
Madam President, so I got that. It took me a fair amount of effort. On page 6 says a definition of conveyance system, and then we have a new definition of public drainage system on page 10. But one of the things you could do is, when you come to the actual rule for like on a conveyance system, you could say C definition, or you could say conveyance system parens, not a public drainage system, closed parens, that sort of thing, to help us know that difference.
Yeah, because it's a pretty important subject here.
Yeah,
I think
it is.
It'll get confused.
Well, I agree with Steve about taking those rules, those 2, 3, and 4 out of there. I just don't feel comfortable doing that, because that's why I say I agree with you. I just don't feel comfortable with that, because the drainage system, even though it's a subset of the entire conveyance system, still provides those benefits that are in 2, 3, and 4 of the policy. And they were, when we go through all this historic review we've been through, that's part of the business we had to prove or provide as the reason for fixing the drainage systems, period, was that you got water quality and you prevented localized flooding and you prevented the loss of the drainage here and the capacities. And so I hate to think that when you separate them so distinctly, the mutual benefits that are in each conveyance system and in a drainage system the drainage system could be lost, that could be ignored for a reason. And I don't want that to happen.
So John, if I could, we need to then go through and parse through specifically what's in 2, 3, and 4, and whether or not they were already incorporated by the new additional language proposed by staff. So, for example,
well, just before you go,
if I could, John, old 2 says to preserve the capacities of drainage systems. That's clearly saved, but to accommodate future needs, we're stuck with ACSIS or whatever it is, ACSIC. So I don't know whether or not to accumulate future needs is in the policy. To improve water quality, that's not part of the drainage system, but it is prevent localized flooding, which is up there.
I disagree with you about the water quality issue, but
I
but
kind
my
of,
point, my point about this is that I think there needs to be some kind of notice in here that these two systems, that these items that we're talking about, that you just parsed through, that those definite, you have to refer back to the conveyance system so that you don't lose them, is what I'm getting at. You know,
I agree with that.
I thought that's what you were getting at earlier.
I was
Yeah.
getting at that earlier.
Yeah, and
Mike,
then,
also, Mike, our Madam President, this is Manager Wagaman. Can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, Mike, and I agree with Mike, and I'm not stuck on them being right there. I just I don't remember seeing these specifically spelled out in clear language anywhere else unless I missed it. And I think those are seriously important things that we do that we shouldn't just be wiping off the map.
I agree with you, Steve.
Well, why don't we let staff take a shot at that and then come back to us with some different wording? Can't we include it in both somehow, or just to list them again?
Yeah, or just, I mean,
I
I
see
just
what you
think
mean.
it's too important.
Yeah, that's what we're all about.
Exactly.
Madam President,
Go ahead.
also something that has now, come up a couple of times in this discussion, to just put out there for the board and Nick, in a number of rule documents or ordinance documents, one technique is to hyperlink to all words that are specifically in the definition section, or at the least to capitalize or bold them, which would be a staff or engineer project of a nature, but it would assist in making the rules more immediately readable to folks, perhaps.
Interesting.
President Priner,
Go ahead.
if I could, in response to that, one of the items that the board budgeted for was our website. This is where that would be most functional. And we can certainly look into drafting in that way, if you will. Obviously, that's a function of an electronic version, so we could certainly look at that. I'm at a bit of a loss, President Priner, to capture definitively what the board is asking, except that they have a keen interest in the preservation of the language of 2, 3, and 4 that was stricken under Rule I. And so I guess I look to either a member of the board or perhaps one of the staff, or Chuck or Chris, if you could communicate it back, I think it'd go a long way to make sure we don't miss the mark with the language that we capture. Can anyone articulate?
Let me try this one.
Okay.
Both the conveyance section and the drainage section are very important. Through both of them, the board, the Watershed District wants to reflect, and I'm trying to get back to it, the water quality. Here, a lot of pages you guys have done. I want to reflect that both systems are preserving capacity of the conveyance / draining system for future needs. They're both in effect to provide water quality and prevent localized flooding. That's some way, because you can't make one as, can't put them closer together, that there's some way of recognizing the advantage and the benefits of both of these. And I think, Steve, to your point about looking at all this red on the public drainage system page without us really having gone through it, I too was kind of lost of, did we talk about that? How did this work?
Yeah.
But it seems like it's staff's attempt to make this read better. And
Right.
I mean, it's just been a little confusing. So maybe if we go forward with it, Nick, and see it written like it would read, as you suggested, it might be more clear for us.
Okay.
Madam
Which is
President,
what we'll see in the next version, yeah.
Right.
Madam President, I've had a chance, thanks to all this discussion, go back and closely read Rule G's policy statement. And it has, I think, the type of language we want to replicate a second time when we come to Rule I. Rule G starts out with and says, the district manages and maintains, and I agree with our council, that we ought to capitalize public drainage system because that's a defined term. And maintains public drainage systems as defined in these rules. And that's when I knew I had to go back and find the definition. Through the exercise of its authority under the drainage code and the application of Rule I. That's my, then it goes on to say the purpose of Rule G, which is where I am now, is to protect the integrity and capacity of surface water conveyance systems other than public drainage systems for the benefit of you. If you keep that here, copy it, paste it, maybe flip it between where we talk about, Rule I first or Rule G first and then I, but regardless. So we did a good job of it here. We just need to say it again, I think, under Rule I. And then we can talk about whether or not we've covered 2, 3, and 4 separately.
Good job, Mike.
So, Madam President,
Go ahead.
I don't have any disagreement with you, Mike, but for clarity, I'd just like to reinsert 2, 3, and 4 in addition to your paragraph.
Yeah, and it's ask staff to figure out where to put that.
Yeah, and John, I agree with you on that one because I just think they're important. They're obvious to us, but they're not to somebody who reads it who doesn't understand anything about it. And I think it's really important for people to, when they look at this, that slaps them right in the face. I mean, they shouldn't have to infer it or figure it out. We get it. They don't. And I think those are 3 critically important things we do that we should have in there somewhere.
Well, they may also belong to be duplicated in G and I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have any. Duplication can be good at times.
Yes.
I have no problem with that.
But it was a long struggle in order to get things like that are described in 2, 3, and 4 recognized by the Board of Managers 25 years ago. And that's why I think their clarity is necessary now for the Board of Managers 25 years from now.
Yeah.
Okay, Nick, you were asking for,
Yeah.
does that help?
I think that's helpful. Thank you very much. Certainly, I would like Chris, Patrick, or Chuck to weigh in as we move forward. What I'm thinking might be best, the red line document, which I certainly agree can be a challenge to read, is important because that is what our partners in the notice folks will look to see how we changed it. If we don't provide that, we'll point to where the changes are, and it'll be difficult for them to understand it. And so we have provided within the packet the red line version as we had it. We had comments from 2 managers, which we changed and were highlighted accordingly in the visual that we've been using here. I think I'm suggesting maybe we do that again. And so we'll have additional highlights, red line, which will identify those things we changed based on our discussion today. We can provide, so for our next packet, we will provide that, and we will also consume a little bit of paper, but we'll give you a clean version so it'll be easy to read. And we'll go from there.
Perfect.
Somebody had just made a comment, but I didn't catch who it was.
Big print's what I said. Said
Oh.
easy to read, I said big print.
Big print.
Big print, okay.
I mean, it doesn't have to be huge, but.
Here's what I used, Jen.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the direction. Was there any other comments that we need today yet? Ready?
Yes, President Preiner, again, Chris, Chuck, or Patrick, please certainly ask the question now. As you know, it can be a challenge for us to, make sure we're all on the same page leaving this meeting.
Mhm.
I understand the comments at this point. Manager Bradley made a good point. I think Rule G kind of does make that distinction between G and I think we can reflect that, also in Rule I. And then items 2, 3, and 4 within Rule I think they're captured in G, but the language is different. So if we just make sure they're both in G and I and the language is consistent, I think that works as well.
Okay. Any concerns with my suggestion to just highlight the changes we made? Chris, you've already got them highlighted with, I think it was blue and yellow. Maybe anything since that time will show as green, and then the clean version.
So you got, Nick, you got a guy who did this for a living for a long time. You're right. So one thing you might do is create a second document that has just the changes you're making today, so that when we meet together as in our next meeting, in our next workshop, I think we'd only have to look at where changes were made as a result of today, but you preserve this document plus those changes to show when we meet with the cities, because you're right, cities are going to have to need to see all of this.
Okay. I saw Chuck nodding on that. I think we're in good shape.
Makes sense.
Claire.
I have one, before we're done, I do have one last one too, whenever it's okay.
Sure.
Okay, on page 28, on the very bottom, under exceptions, on A, I just would like to point out the whole thing, a permit not required and all that for 10,000 square feet, excluding the driveway. And at the end, it says, if the lot is within a development previously approved by the district, the construction must conform to the previous approval. I would just like to remind everybody that that's exactly what we're discussing when we discuss forgiving the cities their debits. Here we're telling a private landowner, sorry, if you fall under the old rule, you're screwed. You go by the old rule. And the cities are coming in and asking forgiveness because of a rule change. I'd just like to say, I think we need to be consistent however we do that with the landowners and with the municipalities.
Well, and that makes sense on this, because if it's already development, it's already approved. An individual landowner can't go changing anything.
I understand. I mean, I'm not saying that we should change anything. I'm just bringing it up for the point being that you start making precedents when you start changing stuff for people. And I just think we need to be fair then between landowners, and I was just using it to bring up a point. That's all. Just for that reason only.
Point taken. Anybody else on this rules?
Madam President,
Go ahead.
just to confirm on the paperwork, ordinarily, what will go out and be published and available for comment are two documents. One would be a red line version of the present rules showing proposed revisions, just one set of uniform red lines. And then there would also be a clean version of the rules as they will read if the proposed rules are adopted. And then those are accompanied by the sonar, which is a memo that just goes through and tries to explain the changes in clear terms. So if we go by the normal procedure, those would be the documents that would be in the August packet for your approval for publication. In addition, what I'm understanding is that obviously we've had the discussion and there are a few respects in which the rules will be modified from what you looked at today. It would seem that staff can simply make available to the board selected portions of the rule where those changes appear. Are there other documents besides those that you are saying you would like to see, or different formats?
Well, oh, go ahead, Mike.
I just said, since I was the one that talked about saving, that works for me just fine. I've spent enough time reading this. I don't need to go try and replicate all that effort again.
So in other words, Mike, what we want to see is what the staff comes up with for Rule G and Rule I. That seems to be
and any other change that we made today that I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, I think most of the changes we have are more grammatical ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. President Preiner,
Go ahead.
point of clarification here with Patrick and then to our consultants. Patrick, I think what we had looked at was we could use the workshop to display those changes we discussed today. And those packets go out a day apart. And so the board packet will have, just as Chuck noted, the red line, the clean version, and the sonar, looking for your approval to release. But we'll have a brief instance with the workshop to show you the changes that we came about from today's discussion, have those illustrated in that document. And of course, it's kind of the last chance to make any changes.
Are you going to have the sonar by next meeting? That surprises me. Unless you've already got it drafted.
Yeah. That was the intent, yes, for the release at the.
Hey, these guys are good, Mike.
I know
I'm impressed. Yeah.
Manager Bradley, if you're looking for the typical state agency 230-page sonar, you're going to be disappointed.
See, now I spent a lot of years looking for state agencies that did those 200-page sonars.
Anything else? Everybody agrees how we're moving forward?
No,
Everybody good?
nothing for me.
Okay, and then I'll just bring right back up here one more time the proposed time frame. We have the board workshop.
Thank you, Chris.
And the board meeting here. I do have review sonar under the board workshop. I don't know if do we just want to have that for the board meeting?
I would, if you can give me a couple days extra to see that, I'd love it.
It'd be nice to have the workshop.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I'll need a motion to adjourn.
Move to
Anybody else?
adjourn.
Okay, we have a motion and a second.
Second,
Any further discussion? Manager Waller,
yes.
Manager Winan,
Yes, good job.
Manager Bradley,
Yes, good meeting.
and Manager Wagaman. And
Yes.
And yes for me, so I think we will adjourn. And again, thank everybody. That was well done. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great meeting.
Yeah.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye now.
Take care.
I know.
See you later.
Bye, everybody.